Hello again, everybody. I'm going to do my part 2 on this universal dichotomy issue. I got a little feedback on this. My brother Dean, especially, he seemed to think that I was against the Endangered Species Act, and he seemed to think that I couldn't understand any reason for endangered species to exist. And he did give me some feedback, which I asked for. Although he may have misunderstood me a little bit on the previous one, so maybe he wasn't the only one. I sounded maybe a little bit like somebody who was coming out against the Endangered Species Act, and I'm not. That's the point I want to make here. I point out that just starting at ground zero for me, I am much in favor of it. I was somebody who worked in favor of it. My point, I suppose, was that I was looking for an issue in which I had pretty much made up my mind, and to show that sometimes you mentally and logically have to revisit issues, and you have to give up your I guess some people would say principles, but not necessarily principles as reconsider everything in your thought processes in order to understand where other people are coming from, in order to be able to consider all sides of an issue. That's what I was talking about. I'm in favor of the Endangered Species Act. I just feel like in some cases we are a little too stringent in our enforcement when it comes to specific issues, and this has to do with land use, and so forth. Not every land use that's prohibited by the Endangered Species Act will cause a species to become endangered. They err on the side of caution a little bit severely, and people who are living out in the countryside a lot of times use that land in order to make a living. And whenever they bring up that point to certain people within the I guess it's the Interior Department of the United States, for example, it falls on deaf ears, because they have this law that says that this is absolutely not considered as a possibility. So what happens is the other side comes along, and they get, let's say the Republicans will get elected, and they will all of a sudden just say, oh, we got to get rid of this Endangered Species Act. Oh, this is ridiculous. In other words, nobody wants to allow the other side any ability to voice their concerns. It's either they take it all or they take none of it. This is the problem, I think, in a lot of politics. There's no room for let's discuss this a little further, because everybody starts shouting at everybody else. They start calling each other names and everything. I realize, and this comes to mind, that people who live out in the country a lot of times, I know some people are going to not like this idea, but they seem to have less respect for the land and for the country than many people who don't live in the country. This is an odd thing, but if you really do love nature, then you're going to live in the city. It's a concept I've always thought about it. In other words, like a hamster in his cage, he puts all his poop in one corner. Well, if you really love the country, you're not going to want to spread out throughout the entire. I ran into one guy, for example. He wanted to where he was working with me as a kind of a gypsy salesman, and he was from out in the country. And when he saved up a lot of money, he said he was going to get an ATV farm. He wanted to get a couple of mountains in West Virginia and open up an ATV farm or whatever, where all-terrain vehicles could ride all over the woods and charge people money to be able to. And I said, well, that sounds bad for the land. That sounds bad for the nature. He says, well, it's just a couple of mountains, he says. So he was a country guy. He didn't have the same concept that, well, maybe these things are ruining the land, But I told him I wanted to dynamite fish. kind of make my point. I says, the best way to fish is just throw dynamite in the lake and blow. You get all kinds of fish that way. Then he thought I was crazy. But to me, he sounded like he wanted to dynamite fish, in a form, but he didn't understand that. Well, anyway, my point about the universal dichotomy is to say that we, maybe as people, think in an either-or situation in almost every one of our questions. It comes up even in religion. There's God or the devil. There's good and there's bad. There's right and there's wrong. And then they get mad at people who talk about relative morality, relative ethics. They say, oh, that's bad. But I run into so many people who just sort of buy the whole thing and don't give it any thought. If you go into a religion and it says, well, you can't eat meat on Friday, well, then all of a sudden, there's no consideration that this is kind of a silly rule. The same thing happens in a lot of different directions. There's people who, once they buy into an idea, they just absolutely can't get away from that idea. I'll give you another one. Is the deregulation. A couple years back, they were talking on the right about, let's get the government off our backs. Let's deregulate everything. There's too many regulations. That's such an inarticulate position. What regulations exactly? There's just way too much. Just get rid of all the regulations, they say. That's a Ron Paul and all of those sort of folks who are the libertarian philosophy. It's just a half-baked way of thinking. Some regulations are well thought out, very reasoned, and very important regulations, such as the whole thing with the banking industry not being allowed to go into the bond market and so forth. Where did that lead us? Such as having regulations on how much capital a person buying a house has to have up front. That was kind of a reasonable regulation, I think. It wasn't, they say, well, the marketplace will take care of it. Well, maybe the marketplace will take care of it. In the meantime, we're all going to go bust, and the economy worldwide is going to go bad because we didn't pay attention to people who had made very important regulations. They were important. They were well thought out, these regulations, and they stopped us from going into a bust period. But there are some people who have this ideology that all regulations are bad. Therefore, we're just going to wipe them off. Well, it's not such a good idea to be so ideological about any type of a political or social issue. You have to, find, the devil is in the details, I guess is what I'm saying. You have to fine-tune things. Otherwise, you're going to be just making, you're going to be like sheep being herded about in one direction or another. There's, when the sheep are all being herded about, it's fine sometimes, when you're going around running from the wolf, but when you're being herded into a slaughterhouse, the one sheep might stop and start to say, why are we going in this direction? We've been just, well, there are no sheep like that, actually. They all just go along with the flow, and they get slaughtered. And we have to start thinking like that as people. We have to start being more, looking at the details of everything that we're looking at, rather than just running into this is good and this is bad, this is God, this is the devil. It's everything in the world seems to work like that, with some exceptions, I suppose. But I mean, the whole computer world, it's either a 0 or a 1, right? I mean, everything breaks down as a dichotomy. And that my point is, though, is when I was talking about the Endangered Species Act before, and I hope I'm not getting too far off here, but that's something that I agree with. But I know that there are some people who have been affected adversely by the the fact that they can't use their own land in the way that they choose. So there must be, we need to think about specific individual instances in almost every case in this. That's what I'm saying. And there may or may not be some animals that end up being extinct, but not every use of land that within a endangered habitat is going to cause the species to become extinct. That's my point. And I was just trying to make the point, because that would be something that I would generally, the Endangered Species Act, agree with. I can go into a lot of other things. The Second Amendment, the guns. The thing about guns. Maybe guns have. There's a lot of people who believe that guns are bad no matter what. We shouldn't allow any people to have any guns, and that's just never going to happen, for one thing. But the people who are pro guns, they don't want to have any type of compromise whatsoever about restricting people from having guns whatsoever. Every one of those laws, even the ones that stopped criminals from being able to buy guns, they opposed. That's because there's no fine-tuning available. There's no consideration of the other side.